Good afternoon. I'm Brett Perlman, and welcome to the Center for Houston's Future Leadership Webcast series. Today's webcast and future webcasts are intended to inform, educate, and engage the community on a wide range of important issues and topics impacting the Houston region. We plan to have these webcasts every Wednesday for the next several weeks and have arranged for discussions with experts on leadership, COVID-19, and other important topics. Through these discussions, we hope to uncover the best issues to address and work through the current crisis and other important issues. And looking past the current situation, consider its implications on the future and determine what actions we as a community need to take now to ensure the social, cultural, and economic well-being of the Houston region. I'd like to introduce our moderator, Russell Richard, and guest, Kirk Watson. Senator Kirk Watson and Russell, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webcast. I'm Russell Richard, Vice President of Leadership and Engagement at the Center for Houston's Future. The Center is a nonprofit established in the year 2000. This year is our 20th anniversary. The Center works to convene business, government, and community stakeholders in fact-based strategic planning and collaborations on issues of the greatest importance for the future of the Houston region. I'd like to take just a moment to acknowledge our leadership alumni who are on the webcast today. On behalf of the entire staff at the Center for Houston's Future, thank you so much for your support of the Center and our work. We couldn't do the work that we do without your generous support and help, so thank you. For those who'd like more information about the Center's work or our leadership program, please contact me or visit our website, futurehouston.org. Our next leadership forum is scheduled to begin September the 24th of this year. The class is already half full, so please contact me soon for more information about the program and registration. Today's webcast is a third in a series of webcasts. First, we spoke with Angela Blanchard, President Emeritus of Baker Ripley and noted expert on disaster recovery. Angela helped us understand the timing and stages of a crisis. Last week, Judy Lee with Take Root helped us understand the concept of adaptive leadership and how it applies to this crisis. This week, our guest, Texas State Senator Kirk Watson, newly named Dean of the University of Houston's Hobby School of Public Affairs, a role that he will begin in May of this year. Senator Watson has been immersed in Texas public policy for 3 decades, first as an appointee by Governor Ann Richards, then elected mayor of Austin in 1997, followed by elected to the Texas State Senate in 2006, where he represented the Austin area for 13 years. Senator Watson has a unique perspective and understands how elected officials should lead during a time of crisis. As in previous broadcasts, we will have a Q&A at the end of the discussion. Please use your Q&A feature in your Zoom app to submit those questions during the conversation. Senator Watson, it's great to have you. Thank you so much for being on the webcast.
I'm very pleased to be a part of this and look forward to working in partnership with the Center for Houston's Future when I get down to Houston at the Hobby School.
Well, thank you so much. We're looking forward to having you in the Houston community. Senator Watson, what I'd like to do is frame our conversation for today in the following ways. First, I'd like for you to help us understand the role of an elected official during a time of a crisis. Second, having served as mayor and also a senior state official, help us understand how local, state, and national elected officials work together. Third, I'd like for you to help us define leadership and some of the lessons that you've learned during your experience and how they apply to this particular crisis. Fourth, where do we go from here? And how does the crisis impact how we move forward? Right. And lastly, we'd be delighted for you to share a little bit about your new role as founding dean at the University of Houston's Hobby School and what some of your goals and visions are and how they might have been impacted by this recent crisis. So let's dive into our conversation. Let's talk about that first theme. In fact, why don't we just combine the first two themes? As mayor and senior state official, help us understand the roles of local elected officials like mayor and county judge, and how they communicate with the governor and the governor's office, and who ultimately has the decision-making authority.
Well, again, thanks for having me on here, and that's a great question, and one that becomes very important, particularly in times of crisis. What is interesting is that I think on a day-to-day basis, people living in Houston, living in Austin, Dallas, Fort Worth, wherever or small towns, one of the things that they look for is they look for that local elected leadership as their first line. It's the people they see. It's the chief of police. It's the mayor. It's the county judge. It's the county commissioners and council members. That is the first place they look for immediate guidance, because to some degree, we've all been trained in that way. When it comes time to talk about getting the garbage picked up, or a pothole in the road, or police presence or fire presence, EMS, things of that nature in our parks, we know that that's who we turn to. In times of crisis, there tends to be more of a looking to the state level. Now, they're still looking at the local level. They're still wanting those local officials, but there's also a question of what will the state do in the immediate sense to meet our particular needs. And that's where the relationship, sometimes it becomes a frayed relationship between local elected officials and state elected officials, in part because I think, frankly, there's politics that gets played in that. We've had, to some degree, because of the strong economy in Texas, we've had at least a sense of a luxury that we could have fights and political disputes that might not be in the best long-term interest. But in a time of crisis, those communication apparatuses have to be put into place so that people are getting the answers they need, that the local elected officials are getting the help when they need it, and that, frankly, at the state level, the eyes on the ground, the folks that are actually dealing with things on a moment-to-moment, day-to-day basis are communicating well with the state leadership.
Well, we have noticed over the last several legislative sessions a shift from local control. How does that impact the decisions that these local authorities, the mayor, county judge, are able to make decisions?
Well, I'll talk about it both politically and from a practical standpoint. From a political standpoint, I think we're seeing more of getting away from the concept of local control, and I think it's a large part of that is just purely politics. It is an effort to rein in, or is the way some people would say it, or change the way people are making decisions because there's political disagreement in most instances. Now, that's not to say that in some instances the decisions are right, wrong, or otherwise. It is simply that there's a disagreement politically. And I think from a substantive standpoint, where that's going to be difficult and a problem is going to be when the legislature decides that it's an appellate court for the local governments. I've never felt like, even, maybe it's the old mayor in me, but I've never felt like that what ought to happen is, if you disagree with the decision at the local level by the elected officials, that you appeal that to the legislature in hopes of overturning it. And part of that is because all of our local communities, our jurisdictions, they are meeting specific needs at a given point in time. I many times point out that really the Texas economy is in most ways the sum of its regional component parts. And the state provides very little tools to local government for doing things like economic development. or to pay for police, fire, EMS, parks, playgrounds, libraries, things of that nature. So that it's probably better to let those very successful local areas do their business, meet the values of their local community, and generally stay out of the way. And I worry that decisions are getting made now, including things like what happens with tax rates and things of that nature, that are going to backfire on those things, and particularly at a time of crisis when there may be really great need to be able to access revenue.
Thank you. Last week, we had Judy Lee, president of Take Root, on the webcast, and she helped us understand the concept of adaptive leadership. And effectively, what she shared with us is that we have a contract with authority figures, our leaders, and in exchange for us giving them authority, they make decisions and act in our best interest. What are some factors do you think that elected officials should take into account when making some of those decisions on our behalf?
Well, that's a really good question. And the way I'll start with my answer is by saying that hopefully elected officials who have gone through the process of an election, where they're actually out there hearing from the people, in many instances in one-on-one situations, hopefully they come to the job with some sense, some gut sense of what the needs are, how people see meeting those needs in a way that they'll see a common benefit. But another part of that is, once in elective office, is a recognition by those elected officials, and we may be talking about some of this later in the conversation, but some of my rules of public policy and my rules of politics include that the elected officials need to be they need to be willing to throw away labels, because they need to not get themselves into a rut where what happens is they label somebody and then they never hear them, because then they lose out on what are potentially good ideas, and they need to figure out how they're going to hear those ideas. The other part about that is, I think it's appropriate for leaders on a routine basis to ask of themselves and their community, what are the core values? What are the core assets? And what are our weaknesses? Lots of times people don't do that. They decide that they know what their values are and they never change, but life changes. I mean, look at what's going on in our world right now. This will change. The values and assets and expose weaknesses, and those leaders need to be prepared to ask those hard questions.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate you sharing that. In fact, I did have the opportunity to take a look at your 10 rules to live by, and I really was impressed by those rules. One in particular that stood out with me, and you just mentioned, we should throw away labels, and we should listen carefully and speak plainly. And I think that is really, really important.
Absolutely.
Keeping with this theme of adaptive leadership, Judy again offered up to us last week that authority and leaders are responsible for making technical decisions. And some of these decisions are decisions that could be resolved just through expertise and information and knowledge. But none of these decisions are easy decisions. And elected officials have to balance many things: economic welfare, health. How do you think that balance occurs?
Well, it starts with, as you just pointed out, one of those rules, which is listening carefully and speaking plainly. The listening carefully part of that is that I really understand those leaders who think that they lead purely from the gut, and that what I was talking about a minute ago, that sense of what the community needs. But few of us that have gotten ourselves elected to office have all of the expertise you might need in specific circumstances. And so what's very important is listening carefully to those with expertise, paying attention to those who know more about public safety and how to bring about public safety than somebody who was successful at just getting themselves elected. Paying attention to health officials and listening to what they have to say. In most local government and in state government, you have experts. You have people that can help you with that, and you need to rely on it. The other part about that is, going back to the listening carefully part of it, they may not be on your professional staff. Now, that's where you want to go early and quick, is the professional staff that may have the expertise that you ought to be listening to, so that you get that technical expertise, and then you can do the balancing. But there are also people in the public that you ought to be listening to. And we need to be creating new ways to hear them, not just at these so-called public hearings where there ain't nobody hearing nothing at a council meeting or a county commissioner's court meeting, but create mechanisms and panels and task forces where you can get good input that then you can react to.
Right. Well, I think you might have fit all of those 10 rules to live by. So
Well, most of them.
Yes, yes. So truly elected officials have a lot to juggle and a lot to balance. But how do they balance when there are other interests, like business interests and business groups and the community? How do they make that balance in making the kinds of decisions that they need to make?
Well, first there has to be a commitment to doing that. There has to be a commitment to wanting to hear from the various groups. Mm-hmm. Part of that goes back also, I mean, I know we keep repeating it, but it's worth repeating, is throwing away the labels. Some people get elected based upon X constituency. And so that constituency was the driving force that got them elected. And so now when they hear from Y constituency, some constituency that's not the one that really got them elected, they put that label on them, and then they abdicate responsibility to hear them. I firmly believe that, particularly in the complexity of governing today, and I don't mean just with COVID-19, I mean just before COVID-19, it was complex enough that people had to be committed to finding ways to listen and at least looking for the good ideas. Because otherwise there's no way to come up with a balance. There's no way to know where you might need to end up. But I want to be clear about something. Elected leadership is never going to meet everyone's concept of perfection. There's always going to be a balance somewhere in there where someone's going to be happy. And one of the easiest ways to fail at leading is by trying to meet everyone's concept of perfection, so that what occurs is you either have something that's completely unworkable because you've defined consensus as 100% agreement, or you've made some person or group the most powerful person in the city because they can veto what you had quite a bit of consensus on. So good leadership knows when to say, all right, I'm moving forward anyway, even if I haven't been able to get you to go along.
Okay. Very good. In keeping with this adaptive leadership theme, it was introduced to us last week that leadership is not necessarily a role or a set of characteristics. It's an exercise of mobilizing resources and motivating and directing people to achieve a particular outcome. Given your experience as a leader, can you give us some insights?
Yeah. So I'll give a couple of examples. One is that I'm real pleased with what Austin's downtown looks like right now. And we badly wanted to have a greater downtown. We had a good downtown, but it wasn't a great downtown. People weren't living in the downtown area. At 5 o'clock, everybody kind of packed up and went home. And so one of the things that we did there was we worked very hard to come up with how you go about building a great downtown. We studied what other cities had done. In other words, we listened to experts. We listened to those that could provide us technical advice, even technical advice to the point of how you start development in one part of the downtown, development in another part, and how you grow them together, things of that nature. But it was a mammoth undertaking of listening to people, seeking advice, and then, as you pointed out in that question, actually going forward and doing it. In one instance, we didn't feel like the private sector was really listening. Well, that's not the right way of saying it. They weren't believing that the government was actually going to be helpful in this. So we started doing public-private partnerships. So that's one example. Another example is, for years, Austin didn't have a medical school. I mean, for years, for decades, for centuries, Austin didn't have a medical school. And a lot of people couldn't understand why the University of Texas at Austin, a tier 1 research university, didn't have a medical school. Well, one of the things that we did there was we listened to a large group of people. I put together a plan of 10 goals in 10 years that we would achieve over a 10-year period related to healthcare and economic development. And we actually then went to the voters and asked them to increase their taxes in order to help pay for those. And that worked. So the fundamental part of your question is, it's okay to talk about this stuff, but then you have to act. And one of my rules of leadership is you have to have a bias toward action. You can't be paralyzed for fear that a better idea might come along and after you've already laid out something, and you can't be paralyzed by the fear of failure. You need to be willing to experiment. And if it doesn't work, learn from it. Move to the next way of doing something.
Thank you. In our very first webcast, Angela Blanchard, President Emeritus of Baker Ripley, offered the idea that during a crisis or moving through a crisis, that not everything should be preserved, that some things should in fact fall away. Do you agree with this idea?
I do. And in fact, I've written about it recently as it specifically applies to COVID-19. I don't think there's any question that this is an enormous event, a multi-generational event, but it's more than an event. It is something that is going to create a new condition. And I think those of us that want to have a brighter future, I think what we need to do is not try to just, when we get through this, recapture or recreate the immediate past. But we need to look at what this condition has exposed about things we can do better or things that are failures in our system, and then work to fix those so that we come out of this. And look, we're faced with the great timeout, aren't we? Everybody's having a timeout from our day-to-day lives.
Everybody is, yeah.
Yeah, let's take advantage of that. Let's take this time out, analyze where we now see flaws in the condition we were living under, and how we build that better. Some things may need to be done completely differently.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, because I was thinking of your recent op-ed in the statement, and you stated that old approaches no longer apply, and a new playbook needs to be developed with fresh eyes, without silos. And I really appreciate you saying that. Do you want to build on that a little bit? Because I thought your op-ed in the statement was a couple of days ago was very well written, and I really enjoyed what you said.
Well, thank you. Well, there's a couple of things to talk about in that. One is this timeout forces us to look at our condition and things like, how does a state the size of Texas, with the population it has, how does the diversity of this state, how do we protect our people in a state this size and this diverse? And how do we prepare for the future based upon questions like that? In this state, with the impact that the double whammy, not just COVID, but also the price of oil. How do we rebuild an economy that is equitable and actually is building toward a future economy? Questions like that. Another issue that has come up is the fact that we have such significant health disparities, and how do we look at ways that we can repair that problem? You know, the truth is that our safety net didn't last very long. It fell. When this happened, our safety net fell apart pretty quickly, and issues that had been issues that were great debates, almost political, like political parties, of issues like how do we deal with providing health insurance coverage through employer-based. Well, that took a big hit the minute there weren't as many employers keeping employees on, and people were left without coverage. The issue, for example, of paid sick leave, which has been a big, interesting discussion in this state for a while, but all of a sudden, it became one of the first things that we implemented was some form of paid sick leave, because of a recognition that the old condition no longer existed, and so it was time to think outside the box. I think we've had, at least we've perceived that we've had a luxury to not have to look at some of those things, not have to truly explore or examine. It's only a perceived luxury, because now in the time out we're experiencing, we've seen that we didn't really have that luxury. So how do we go about the new playbook for preparing for the future?
Right. Well, using your phrase, time out, I think we all have a bit more time to think about how we move forward, what needs to remain and what needs to fall away. Can you give any other examples of things that may need to change, move forward, or things that may in fact hold us back if we continue to hold on to them?
Well, let's talk about what we're doing right now. The idea of remote access.
Good point.
You know, some of us had done some of that. I remember passing legislation a couple of sessions ago. It was geared more at dealing with our transportation needs in the Austin area. In case you don't know, Austin has some traffic problems. You've heard about that. So one of the things that we did is we passed legislation that would make it easier for state employees to work remotely. Thinking it wasn't like what we're doing now, trying to solve a public health problem. It was, is this a way to reduce cars that are going to be on the road? And there was great pushback on that. In fact, we passed the bill both in the House and the Senate with the bare minimum. I got it to the Senate floor with the bare minimum, and it passed in the House at one point on one of the votes with 76 votes, but the bill got vetoed. Well, that's an example of something maybe we need to go back and look at now that everybody is working, that's working, not everybody, some of our essential workers aren't doing that, but we now can examine how we deal with remote access in a way that maybe we had the luxury of we acted like we had the luxury of ignoring it before, but it could do real good. And then one other area I would mention, I just mentioned essential workers. It is irony at its worst that many of the people, because of this timeout, that aren't getting the same timeout, that we have labeled to be essential workers. They are essential to how this society can even continue moving on during a pandemic. But yet those are people that we've up now not been willing to pay a living wage. Or we said they're not entitled to paid sick leave. How is it that we can label them both essential and not provide them a minimum way of life? They're essential to our culture. They're essential to our society. So we need to really evaluate what we want to do in the new condition.
Yeah, Agreed. Senator Watson, thank you so much. I'm really enjoying this conversation, but I want to be sensitive to time as well. And I want to allow some time for our viewing audience to submit some questions. But
Well, your questions were short. It was those answers that were so long.
Well, first, again, congratulations on your new role as founding dean at the University of Houston, the Hobby School of Public Affairs. I want to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about that and perhaps share with us your vision and some of your goals, and how that vision and some of those goals may have been impacted by this crisis.
Well, that's really great. I see this as a wonderful opportunity. I would not have left the Texas Senate in the role that I had in the Texas Senate and the role I had in Austin, Texas, but for an extremely compelling platform. And being able to be part of building a world-class public policy school located in one of the nation's largest cities and arguably one of its most, if not the most diverse cities, creates that compelling platform. So much good has already happened at the Hobby School. Dr. Jim Granado and Renee Cross and others that have been part of that school getting us to where we are today, boy, my hat is off to them. The president of the University of Houston, Renew Couture, I've had the opportunity, I've served on the higher education committee the whole time I've been in the Senate, so I've had the opportunity to watch her be aggressively creative at the University of Houston. And Paula Short, the provost, I've gotten to know her through this process. These are folks that want to see a world-class school where what we're really going to do is we're going to be plugged into all of the public policy we can get ourselves plugged into in the city of Houston. We're going to train the next generation of leaders to be able to not only have skill set to put to action, which we've talked so much about here today, but also do the kind of research that really informs great public policy. And in partnership with the wonderful city of Houston, become this world-class center. So, School of Public Policy. So it's a very exciting time. You ask about the COVID aspect of that. There is, in my view, this new condition will be a central part of public policy, whether it's in government, business, nonprofit, for the foreseeable future. And if we do it right, for the long-term future, because we will create a new playbook. And I hope and believe that the Hobby School of Public Affairs at the University of Houston will play a key role in that.
Well, thank you very much. We are thrilled to have you in the Houston community.
Thanks.
And sorry that the circumstances are what they are, but I think the work that you're going to do at the Hobby School, the timing couldn't be better. I think the attention to that work is going to have a very high profile given everything that we've experienced thus far with this crisis.
And one thing I would like to say is I want to hear from the city of Houston, the people of Houston. Go back to where we started this conversation about listening and being careful about listening. I want to know from Houston, what does it want in creating a world-class public policy school so that we are Houston's public policy school?
Well, Austin's loss is our gain. So thank you very much. I want to transition now and get to some of the questions that are coming in. And my first question for you is, this is going back to the conversation that we're having about what things should fall away as we move forward. And the question is that, who gets to decide what gets kept and what gets disregarded?
Well, ultimately, the people are going to decide that, right? What I hope happens is that our leadership listens, seeks out input, and doesn't just revert back to the old way, the old easy way of doing it. But ultimately, that's going to require, as we know, elections matter.
Mhm.
And when we get into questions about air quality, for example, and whether this new condition offers us the opportunity to do better in the future when it comes to air quality, because by the way, the timeout has shown a decrease in negative air quality because of the decrease in movement and travel, things like remote access. And so the question becomes, are the people going to ask for that? Things like I've already talked about. How do we assure health care? How do we assure coverage? How do we deal with the health disparities and the inequality we've seen? Those are questions that the public will be asking, and they ought to be asking of their leadership. Now, I think that there will be a role for additional research, figuring out and getting ideas. For example, in public schools, we've seen that the use of remote technology and remote learning in our K through 12 and pre-K through 12. But the problem with that is, will we take the time to analyze what worked and what didn't work? Because I will tell you, at least in some of those early grades, you need to have a teacher. There's more that goes on in those schools than simply looking at a screen. For that matter, what are the social services that we're going to provide and need to provide more of in those schools? Because overnight, we realized a lot of those students weren't getting food. So the question is, who makes those decisions? Elections matter. And ultimately, it will be the people that make those decisions.
Well, our next question is, how are you preparing to make the transition from a political arena into an academic arena? And how will you instill in your faculty and students this notion of no labels and without bias?
Well, I'll start with the last part of that question, and that is, I'll be preaching it all the time. If you can't tell, I can go to preaching on something, and I'll be preaching it. I'll be preaching it full time.
Sure.
But the good news is, I'm already, even though I'm not supposed to start till May, the faculty and staff will tell you that I'm pretty engaged already, and they have been so gracious with their time and helping me get up to speed. There's a lot I have to learn. I know, as I told somebody the other day, I don't know what I don't know, but I do know I don't know everything. And so I'm working on that. So I'm spending a lot of time reading. I'm spending a lot of time talking to the folks that have been in charge and have done such a good job. And I've been appointed to a task force already at the University of Houston, and I'm involved in that. So I'm having to do things remotely, which is not my way,
Right.
but I'm getting there.
Well, I think we're all having to work
Yeah.
differently these days. And it sounds like you haven't gotten here yet, but it sounds like you've already hit the ground running, so to speak.
Well, so to speak.
Yeah. My next question is, what does this crisis reveal about our economic values?
Oh, well, I think it's laid bare some of those. I mentioned a couple of things a minute ago, but they're worth repeating, I think. One is that when the safety net, the infrastructure that is supposed to support our well-being unravels this rapidly, we have to question whether or not we were placing a great enough value on the infrastructure of our well-being. The way I kind of think of it, and I don't know if this is a good example, but this has been likened to going to war, right? Well, not so much in this country, but we've all grown up seeing pictures of the infrastructure, the hard infrastructure like buildings and roads and bridges after war, where they're down, they don't exist, and you have to go in and you have to rebuild. Well, that's kind of how I feel has happened with some of the infrastructure of our well-being, the safety net, insurance coverage, and what value we actually were placing on how people are getting their insurance coverage, the disparities in healthcare that I've already mentioned. When we see populations, demographic populations with so much higher incidence of death, then that is part of our value structure and part of what we ought to be thinking of in terms of our value structure. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing I'll mention, of course, is what I said just a second ago, which is this idea that we can label you an essential part of our economy, an essential part of our culture and our way of life, but at the same time, you're not in a position to be able to afford childcare. You're not in a position to be able to take time off if you have a sick loved one or if you're sick, and your wages are so low. Those are values, and I said earlier, it's important for us, I think, as individuals, elected leaders, people that care to, from time to time, reevaluate our values. Well, I think it's okay for a society to reevaluate its values. And we have this time out, so why don't we do it?
Well, in keeping with this theme on values, how do you see Texas and Houston reopening, balancing health and the economy?
I'd say two things. First of all, I'm not sure I know. I'll be willing to say that right off the bat. But I'll say two things. One is one of the things that is so attractive about Houston, particularly in building a public policy school in a place like Houston, is the resilience, the entrepreneurial resilience of that place. When I was considering taking this job, I talked to somebody who had spent some time, he was from Austin, went to Houston, and is now back in Austin. And I was talking to him, and one of the things he told me that after the hurricane, he said to his wife, if any town can come back from that bigger and stronger, it's Houston. And I think he's right about that because of the nature of the people and the place. So that's one thing I would say is the resilience of Houston, I think, will play out in this. But then the second thing I want to say is I think it's going to require at state level and at the local level, and I hope at the national level, but at the state level and the local level, that we pay attention to one of the questions you asked earlier, which is the technical expertise. Mm-hmm. I think folks are ready to get back to work. I think people, I'm glad to have put on a suit coat today. It's the first time I've put on a suit coat in a while. Now, I won't tell you what my shoes look like, but my point being that I think people are ready, and I think people are worried about what happens to the economy. But I think it has to be done in a thoughtful, scientific way that we get to that. And from what I see, our officials in Texas, at the local level and the state level, they're trying to pay attention to that in the right way.
Well, let's stick with that for just a second. What is your assessment of how state leaders have handled this COVID-19 crisis? And if you want to comment on a national level, we'd be happy to hear that as well.
Yeah, well, go back to some of what I have said about rules of public policy.
Sure.
Listen carefully and speak plainly.
Right.
I think you, as a general rule, have had both at the state level and at local elected officials have done that. They've tried to listen. Not everything has been perfect. And they've also tried to speak plainly so that people will know what the rules are they need to try to live under. And frankly, I think that's one of the reasons in Texas you've seen people react the way they have. I also think that early on, both at the state and the local level, there was an emphasis to look to the experts. Dr. Hellerstadt, who is our Commissioner of Health and works at DSHS, he's been involved and been on the front line of this from the very beginning. Nim Kitt, who is the Director of Emergency Management. The fact that the governor brought in a former state representative from the Houston area and now Executive Vice Chancellor for Health Affairs at the University of Texas System, John Zerwas. The fact that you see that, and you're seeing it, by the way, in Houston with the local elected officials, you're seeing it in other places as well. Now, there are some things that I might say, I wish they'd have done that differently. They should have spoken more plainly on this, that, or the other. But as a general rule, I think you're seeing I think you're seeing the public's reaction in a positive way, in large part because there's credibility to what they're being told, and they're being told what they need to know.
Well,
By the way, you asked about it, and I'll just touch on it briefly. That is significantly different than what you hear at the national level.
Sure. Which of our most pressing social issues do you think will get the most attention or the most momentum after this pandemic? Do you think healthcare access, immigration rights, criminal justice, voting rights? Which one of these do you think will get the most attention and perhaps build the most momentum following the pandemic?
Well, you have basically outlined a very good platform for what ought to be part of the legislative session. I would add education to that. How do we, and frankly, I'd add infrastructure, because we're going to have to deal with the economy, but on the education, how is it that, how do we deal with higher education? And frankly, I've touched on it. What do we do with K through 12 and even pre-K? How do we deal with that? Because a big part of what's going to be going to dominate the session is going to be budget. But if I had to pick one, I would, and this is just speculation, what I would pick would get the highest attention probably would be healthcare, only because this is a public health situation which focuses our attention. But I don't think we ought to get focused on just that to the exclusion of every one of the things you mentioned and education, because we're going to have crises in each one of those. And to go back to my previous point, and that is, I think we lose an opportunity here if we don't take advantage of trying to be innovative and use this time out and the new condition to innovate in every one of those areas. Texas can do that. Houston can do that. The University of Houston and the Hobby School can do that. And I think it's a responsibility.
Well, now that state and local leaders are considering lifting the social distancing requirements, what are your thoughts about how this decision should be made? I mean, what caution should we take as we move forward?
Well, I think it needs to be based on science. It goes back to your question. You used the word earlier about balance, and that is true. We want to pay attention to the economy. People are going to suffer greatly as a result of this. But what we don't want to do is make rash decisions that aren't based upon the technical expertise and the science, so that what we do is it results in loss of life that is unnecessary. But we also don't want to create a bigger problem than we would have otherwise, because we move based upon what we want as opposed to based upon what we need. And so we end up having spikes that are much greater, that end up creating greater economic problems down the road. We don't want to use the old trite phrase, bite off our nose to spite our face. Right. So it has to be based on science. And I think that's easy enough to do.
Well, let's wrap up with a question aimed at your new role in the Hobby School. Okay. What leadership role do you think that the Hobby School might take in researching and analyzing this new condition?
Well, we're already doing some stuff. We're already doing surveys where we're we're partnering with different industries, like the restaurant industry. We're talking to the automobile dealers. We're talking to business groups. And what the reason we're doing that is, and there's others, but the reason we're doing that is because we believe that we can be a credible source of information, not just for those partners, those industry groups that need to hear from their people, and we can provide that resource. They need to hear from their people so that they can act and react to their needs, but also so that we can inform public policy. But that's just one simple example, early example would be a better way of saying it, of how we involve. I believe we will be able to, one of the things that I want to do, don't know that I'll be able to pull this off, but we ought to be prepared to provide training camps for elected officials and professional staff in local government on crisis management. And you come out of this recognizing there are things like that we can teach. By the way, I could see that becoming something that the University of Houston does for the Houston community in a variety of different ways, not just in local government. And then I think the research that you'll see out of this and the training about how to deal with public policy, I don't even think we know yet all that we'll be asked to do in that regard. But here's my commitment. I want the hobby school to be at the center of, I want to be plugged into public policy discussions from top to bottom. I want us to play the role of convener and helping with the collaboration that's needed so that we can move public policy in a positive way forward.
Well, Senator Watson, thank you so much for your time today. This has been a great conversation. And again, congratulations to you on your new role at the Hobby Center. And please, if there's anything that the Center for Houston's Future can do to assist you, please don't hesitate to let us know.
I'm looking forward to partnering with you. Thank you very much for that offer.
Thank you to our viewers for tuning in today. Please be on the lookout for more information about our next leadership webcast next week. I'm Russell Richard. Good day, be safe, and stay well.